The warning came on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day for warnings of this kind, because the men who issued them had long since stopped believing that the day of the week had any bearing on their effectiveness and had settled into the practice of delivering them whenever the operational logic of their situation indicated that delivery was required, which in this instance it had indicated on a Tuesday in the spring of 1879 in a town called Redemption Creek, a name that had been given to it by its founder with a combination of optimism and irony that the subsequent decade had resolved decisively in favor of the irony, the creek having dried up 3 years after the town was established and the redemption having proven similarly elusive for most of the people who had come looking for it. The man who delivered the warning was named Vincent Crowe, and he was not a man who delivered warnings personally as a rule, because personal delivery required a proximity to the recipient that Vincent Crowe had learned, over the course of a career that had taken him through several territories and a sequence of increasingly refined methods for extracting value from other people's labor and fear, to be an inefficient use of his specific skills, and so the personal delivery on a Tuesday morning in Redemption Creek was itself a communication, a message embedded in the medium of the message, which was that the situation had reached a point where Crowe felt it warranted his direct attention rather than the delegated attention he preferred for ordinary matters, and the reason it had reached this point was the man standing across from him on the main street of Redemption Creek, whose name was Wyatt Earp, and who had arrived in Redemption Creek 11 days earlier and in those 11 days had done a series of things that were individually unremarkable and collectively intolerable from the perspective of Vincent Crowe's ongoing enterprise. Wyatt Earp had arrived in Redemption Creek by way of decisions that had nothing to do with Vincent Crowe and everything to do with the specific geography of available options at a particular moment, which was a pattern that the towns Wyatt moved through tended, in retrospect, to find meaningful and that Wyatt himself found simply practical, because the towns that needed him were always towns that had arrived at some version of the same configuration, which was the configuration of a place where the ordinary mechanisms of civic order had been captured or overwhelmed or simply outrun by the velocity of whatever was happening economically in and around the town, and Redemption Creek had arrived at this configuration through the discovery of silver in the hills to the east, a discovery that had occurred 18 months earlier and had produced, with the reliability that significant mineral wealth always produced in that era in that geography, a rapid and disorderly expansion of the town's population and commercial activity and, in direct proportion to both, its criminal infrastructure, which Vincent Crowe had arrived to provide approximately 6 months after the silver discovery and had been providing efficiently and without significant interruption since. Wyatt had not been looking for Redemption Creek specifically, in the sense that the name had not appeared on any list of destinations he maintained, because he did not maintain lists of destinations, had never operated on the basis of advance planning in that sense, but had instead operated on the basis of a continuously updated assessment of where he was and what the immediate adjacent geography offered in terms of work and shelter and the specific kind of situation that his particular skill set was suited to address, and Redemption Creek had presented itself as an available option at a moment when he was between other commitments, and the assessment of what was happening there, assembled from the accounts of 3 different people he had spoken to in the previous week, had produced a picture that was sufficiently specific to be actionable, which was the quality he looked for in accounts of towns he had not yet visited, and so he had ridden south and east and arrived in Redemption Creek on a Monday morning and had spent the following 11 days assembling the more detailed picture that only presence could provide. What the 11 days produced was a picture of Vincent Crowe's operation that was more sophisticated than the external accounts had suggested, not in the sense of being more elaborately constructed, because the basic architecture was the standard architecture that Wyatt had encountered in variations across a dozen towns, but in the sense of being more thoroughly integrated into the town's legitimate commercial life, the tendrils of Crowe's influence extending into the assay office and the freighting company and 2 of the 3 general stores and the town's fledgling bank, which was not a bank in any fully developed sense but a building with a safe and a ledger and a man behind a desk who understood that his primary obligation was not to the depositors whose money filled the safe but to the man whose understanding of what the bank was actually for had made its establishment possible. And this integration meant that disrupting Crowe's operation required disrupting not a criminal enterprise that existed alongside the town's legitimate economy but one that had positioned itself as a load-bearing element of that economy, which was a more complex problem than the external accounts had prepared Wyatt for and which required a more careful and considered approach than problems of the simpler type. The 11 days had also produced a badge, which was the element of the situation that had triggered Vincent Crowe's decision to deliver the warning personally, because the badge was information of a specific kind that Crowe's assessment of the situation had not previously contained, and information of that kind required direct processing rather than delegated processing, because its implications were too consequential to trust to the interpretive capacity of intermediaries. The badge had been produced by the town's mayor, a man named Arthur Lund, who occupied the position with the specific mixture of genuine civic intention and structural compromise that Wyatt had encountered in mayors of towns like this one before. Men who had arrived wanting to build something and had discovered that the thing they were building was already embedded in a set of arrangements that preceded their intentions and that those arrangements had opinions about what the building would and would not include. And Lund had been operating within those arrangements for long enough that the operating had come to feel like the only available option, until Wyatt Earp had sat across from him in his office on the 5th day after arriving and asked him a series of questions that reframed the available options in a way that Lund had not encountered before, and the reframing had produced, on the 8th day, the badge, which Lund had extracted from the locked drawer of his desk where it had been sitting and used since the previous marshal had left Redemption Creek 14 months ago under circumstances that everyone in town understood and nobody discussed. Wyatt had taken the badge from Lund's desk and held it for a moment, the specific weight of it communicating nothing that the weight of badges had not communicated to him many times before, which was to say communicating everything and requiring nothing. And then he had pinned it to his coat and buttoned the coat over it and gone back out into the main street of Redemption Creek, and the coat was still buttoned when he ran into Vincent Crowe's associate on the afternoon of the 8th day, a man named Davis who functioned as Crowe's primary intelligence asset within the town, meaning the man whose specific responsibility was to know things that Crowe needed to know before Crowe needed to know them. And Davis had seen the slight asymmetry in the way the coat hung over the left breast, the small distortion that a badge made in the fabric of a coat, and had reported this to Crowe, and Crowe had thought about it for 2 days, which was how long it took him to arrive at the calculation that produced the Tuesday morning conversation, and the calculation had produced the personal delivery. Vincent Crowe was 51 years old and had been doing what he did for long enough that he had developed, around the practice of it, a set of theories about human behavior that were accurate within the population of people he had previously encountered and that he applied with considerable confidence to new situations and new people. And the theory he applied to Wyatt Earp was the theory he applied to all lawmen who arrived in towns where he was operating, which was a theory about the relationship between official authority and personal risk tolerance, specifically the theory that men who wore badges did so because the badge provided a form of institutional backing that made individual action less personally costly than it would be without the backing, and that this institutional dependency meant that the way to move a badged man was to make clear that the institution behind the badge was either unwilling or unable to provide the backing it implied, which in Redemption Creek was easy to demonstrate because the institution behind Wyatt Earp's badge was Arthur Lund, and Arthur Lund's actual capacity to back anything was, as both Crowe and Lund understood clearly, approximately nothing. This theory was accurate for the population of men it had been developed on. It was not accurate for Wyatt Earp, and Vincent Crowe would spend the subsequent weeks discovering in detail exactly how it was not accurate, but on the Tuesday morning when he delivered the warning personally he did not yet know this, and so he delivered the warning with the specific confidence of a man whose theory has worked consistently enough that he has stopped checking it against new information before applying it. And the warning was clear and professionally phrased and communicated. Precisely what Crowe intended it to communicate, which was that Wyatt Earp's continued presence in Redemption Creek had costs that would be borne by Wyatt Earp specifically, that Arthur Lund's badge was a piece of metal with no practical weight behind it, and that the most efficient resolution of the situation from everyone's perspective was for Wyatt to understand these facts and act accordingly. Wyatt listened to the warning with the flat, patient attention he brought to everything, and when Crowe had finished Wyatt looked at him for a moment in the way that made the men he looked at in that way later struggle to describe what exactly it was they had been in the presence of, and then he reached up with his left hand and unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his coat and folded the lapel back to expose the badge that had been pinned to the coat beneath it, and he looked at Crowe while he did this, not at the badge, just at Crowe, and then he buttoned the coat again and walked away, and Vincent Crowe stood on the main street of Redemption Creek and watched him go and spent the rest of the morning in the specific cognitive state of a man whose theory has just produced a result that the theory cannot account for, which is to say in the cognitive state of a man who is going to need a new theory and does not yet know what it is. The problem with the new theory, from Crowe's perspective, was that developing it required understanding something about Wyatt Earp that Crowe's existing framework did not have the conceptual vocabulary to contain, which was the fact that the badge was not, for Wyatt Earp, a source of institutional backing in the sense that Crowe's theory required, was not something that made individual action less personally costly by providing the weight of an institution behind it, because Wyatt Earp's individual action did not require institutional weight to proceed, had never required it, had in fact consistently proceeded in circumstances where the institutional weight was absent or actively opposed, and what the badge was for him was something different and considerably simpler, which was a communication to the people in his environment about what he was doing there and what they could expect from his presence, a signal rather than a source of support, and the signal was accurate. Regardless of whether Arthur Lund's actual institutional capacity was zero or otherwise, because the accuracy of the signal derived from Wyatt Earp and not from Arthur Lund. This distinction was the one that Crowe's theory could not process, and its unprocessability was the reason the theory produced the wrong result when applied to Wyatt Earp, and it was a distinction that Crowe would have to learn empirically over the following weeks rather than theoretically in advance. Because theories about men like Wyatt Earp tended to resist theoretical development and yield only to the specific pedagogy of encountering him directly in the situations where what he was became operational. Wyatt spent the 3 days following the warning in the same pattern he had established in the preceding 11, moving through the town with the specific quality of presence that was neither aggressive nor avoidant but simply consistent, visible in the places where things were happening and absent from the places where nothing was happening, and this consistency was itself a form of action, because the consistent visibility of a man who had just been warned to leave and had responded by exposing his badge and walking away was information that moved through the town in the way that all significant information moved through small towns, which was rapidly and without editorial comment but with considerable editorial implication. And the implication that moved through Redemption Creek in the 3 days after the warning was that something was different about this particular man and this particular badge, and that the calculation that had organized the town's daily life for the preceding year might be in the process of revision. The first person to act on this implication was not someone Wyatt had approached or cultivated or in any direct sense recruited, but a woman named Clara Hollister who ran the town's smaller general store and who had been paying Crowe's associate a monthly sum that she understood to be the cost of operating her business in Redemption Creek, and that she had been paying for 14 months with the specific combination of resentment and resignation that characterized every business owner in the town who was paying a similar sum, and who had watched Wyatt Earp walk down the main street on the Wednesday after the warning with his coat buttoned over his badge and his hat level and his pace unchanged from what it had been on the Tuesday and on the Monday before that, and who had gone home that evening and sat at her kitchen table for a long time, and then the following morning had walked to the marshal's office, which was a room in the back of the building that also housed the assay office, and which Wyatt had been using for 4 days, and had told him, in the specific voice of a woman who has decided to do something irreversible and is not going to stop now that she has started, everything she knew about how Vincent Crowe's collection operated and who conducted it and when and how much and where the records were kept. What Clara Hollister told him took 2 hours and produced, in combination with what Wyatt had already assembled through 11 days of direct observation, a picture of Crowe's operation that was now sufficiently detailed to be the basis of action rather than merely the basis of further observation, and Wyatt thanked her with the economy that he brought to all communication that was not operationally necessary, which was to say briefly and without elaboration, and she left, and he sat in the room that functioned as his office and went through what he had and determined what he needed and made the assessments that the situation now required. What he had was a detailed account of the collection operation, the names and routes and schedules of the men who conducted it, the location of the records that documented it, and a picture of the relationship between the collection operation and the legitimate commercial life of the town that was now specific enough to be actionable in the legal sense as well as the practical one, which was important because Wyatt's preference, when the legal sense and the practical one aligned, was to use the legal sense, not because he was incapable of the practical one without it, but because the legal sense produced outcomes that outlasted his presence in a way that the purely practical one did not, because towns needed to function after he left and the functioning required structures that the purely practical could not leave behind. What he needed was a federal circuit judge, because the scope of what Crowe had built exceeded the jurisdictional capacity of a town marshal to address on his own, and the nearest federal circuit judge was in Tucson, which was 4 days' ride. And Wyatt had spent the following day writing a letter that was specific enough to be actionable and general enough to protect Clara Hollister and the other sources whose safety depended on their names remaining out of official documents for the time being, and had given the letter to a writer he trusted to get it to Tucson without it passing through any of the hands that Crowe's operation had compromised, and had then settled into the work of making Redemption Creek increasingly uncomfortable for Vincent Crowe's operation while the federal machinery moved at the pace that federal machinery moved. The making uncomfortable was the part of the work that most people who watched Wyatt Earp operate focused on because it was the visible part, the part that produced observable events and quotable moments and the specific quality of public incident that became the material of stories told in other towns for years afterward. And the making uncomfortable in Redemption Creek produced several events of this kind over the following 3 weeks, events that involved Crowe's collectors and Wyatt's badge and the main street of Redemption Creek at various hours of the day, and that resolved themselves, in each case, in the direction that events involving Crowe's men and Wyatt Earp consistently resolved in all of the towns where they had previously occurred, which was in Wyatt's favor and without the expenditure of more than what the situation required, and sometimes without the expenditure of anything at all except presence and the specific quality of attention that Wyatt brought to situations of this type. The most significant of these events occurred on a Saturday afternoon 2 weeks after the warning, when 3 of Crowe's men attempted to remove from the town jail 2 of their colleagues whom Wyatt had arrested the previous evening for assault, an attempt that was conducted in the specific manner of men who had been told that the operation required this and who had accepted the assignment without fully processing what the assignment required them to do, which was to walk up to the marshal's office in the middle of a Saturday afternoon on the main street of a town that had been watching for 2 weeks as a series of such attempts resolved themselves in a particular direction, and to attempt to take prisoners from a man who was standing in the doorway of the marshal's office with the specific quality of stillness that communicated, to anyone who had been paying attention for the preceding 2 weeks, that the attempt was not going to produce the result the 3 men were anticipating. The three men spent several minutes on the street in front of the marshal's office in a conversation with Wyatt that the people watching from the windows and the boardwalks on both sides of the street could not hear but could read in its entirety from the body language of the participants, which told a story whose structure was familiar by now to everyone in Redemption Creek. Three men arriving with a clear intention and departing without it, the intention left behind on the street somewhere, invisible but present, the way the aftermath of certain kinds of encounters leaves something in the air that everyone can sense and nobody can quite point to. And the three men walked away and the two prisoners remained in the jail and Wyatt turned and went back inside and the main street of Redemption Creek returned to its ordinary noise, and that ordinary noise was different from what it had been 2 weeks earlier, different in a way that was difficult to specify but that everyone in town could hear. Vincent Crowe heard it too. He had been hearing it for 2 weeks, in the form of small frictions in operations that had previously run without friction, in the form of information he was not receiving that he should have been receiving, in the form of conversations that were happening in Redemption Creek that were not happening the way they had habitually happened. And he had been processing all of it through the filter of a man who has constructed an enterprise on the basis of a particular relationship to a particular environment and who understands that the enterprise's continued function depends on that relationship remaining stable, and the processing was producing a picture of a stability that was eroding in ways that his available responses were not arresting, and the picture was one that a man of Crowe's experience and intelligence could not look at without understanding what it meant, which was that the enterprise had encountered something that the enterprise was not designed to handle, and that the something had arrived with a badge that Arthur Lund had no actual capacity to back and had remained after being told to leave and had made the calculation that the warning was intended to produce and had arrived at a different answer than the warning was designed to produce, and that the different answer was walking down the main street of Redemption Creek every day and would continue walking down it until the federal machinery arrived from Tucson. The federal circuit judge arrived on a Wednesday morning 5.5 weeks after Wyatt's letter had been dispatched, accompanied by 2 federal marshals and a set of documents that had been prepared in Tucson on the basis of Wyatt's account and the account of several other witnesses whose names had been added to the record once it became clear that the federal apparatus was actually in motion and that the cost of adding their names was now lower than the cost of keeping them off it, and what followed was 3 days of the specific procedural activity that federal authority produced in situations of this kind, and at the end of the 3 days Vincent Crowe was in custody and 4 of his associates were in custody and the records that Clara Hollister had told Wyatt about were in the hands of the federal marshals and the bank that had been functioning as a load-bearing element of Crowe's operation was under the management of a receiver appointed by the circuit judge, and Redemption Creek was in the condition that towns were in after the thing that had been wrong with them for a long time had been addressed, which was a condition of disorientation mixed with relief, the specific disorientation of a place that had organized its daily life around a set of arrangements for long enough that the arrangements had come to feel like the landscape rather than a human construction imposed on it, and that was now encountering the landscape without the construction and discovering that the landscape was different from what the construction had led it to believe. Wyatt stayed in Redemption Creek for 10 more days after Crowe's arrest, doing the ordinary work of a town that was rebuilding the ordinary functions that the previous arrangements had crowded out, and on the morning of the 11th day he unpinned the badge and placed it on Arthur Lund's desk without ceremony, with the specific absence of ceremony that communicated that the object was being returned rather than surrendered. And Lund had looked at the badge on his desk for a moment and then looked up at Wyatt and said something that Wyatt had nodded at once, briefly, and then turned and walked out, and whatever Lund had said was between the two of them and was not recorded in any account of what happened in Redemption Creek in the spring and early summer of 1879, which was the appropriate condition for what Lund had said. Because some things belong to the specific moment that produced them and to the specific people present in that moment and did not survive translation into the public register without losing the quality that made them worth saying. The badge sat on Lund's desk for 2 days after Wyatt rode out of Redemption Creek, and then Lund put it in the locked drawer where it had been for the 14 months before Wyatt arrived, and it stayed there for a long time, and the town kept going, and the silver kept coming out of the hills. And the commerce that the silver produced organized itself around the legal structures that the Federal Circuit judge's visit had established rather than around the informal structures that Crowe's operation had provided, and it was not a perfect organization and it was not a simple one and it required ongoing maintenance of the kind that no visiting lawman could provide, but it was the organization of a place that had remembered what it was trying to be, which was the only kind of organization that lasted. The warning that Vincent Crowe had delivered on a Tuesday morning had been intended to produce a departure, and the badge that Wyatt Earp had exposed and then covered again in response to it had been intended to communicate a refusal, and both of these things were true as far as they went, but the actual content of the exchange on the main street of Redemption Creek that Tuesday morning was something that neither of them had put into words, because the words were not the point, were never the point, were the surface of a communication that took place underneath them and that was understood by both parties with the clarity that comes from each of them knowing exactly what kind of thing they were dealing with and what kind of thing they were, and what the exchange communicated underneath the words was this: that one of them had arrived at Redemption Creek with the intention of remaining there until the situation required something and then doing that something and leaving, and the other had been operating in Redemption Creek with the intention of continuing to operate indefinitely, and the question that the exchange raised was whose intention was going to organize the subsequent events. And the answer to that question had been given not in the warning and not in the badge but in the specific quality of the walk that followed the badge, the unchanged pace, the level hat, the coat buttoned back over the exposed metal, the direction maintained, and if Vincent Crowe had been able to read that walk accurately he would have known the answer before the subsequent events confirmed it. But the walk was the kind of thing that could only be read accurately by people who had seen it before or by people who were very good at reading things that had no translation into the available vocabulary. And Vincent Crowe was neither of these things, which was why the warning had been delivered in the first place and why the outcome it was designed to produce had not been the outcome that arrived. There is a particular kind of statement that requires no words to make, that is complete in a gesture or an absence of gesture, that communicates with a precision that language cannot match precisely because language is too slow and too public and too subject to the interpretive habits of the person receiving it. And the gesture that Wyatt Earp made on the main street of Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1879 was a statement of this kind, a statement that used the specific objects it used: a coat, 2 buttons, a piece of tarnished metal, and the motion of a man who had heard what he needed to hear and was now returning to what he had been doing. With the economy that characterized every other action of his life, no more than what was needed, no less than what was required, exactly sufficient and precisely aimed, and the person it was aimed at received it with the clarity that the economy of its delivery demanded, received it in the part of him that was older than his theories and his methods and his accumulated professional practice, the part that understood, without the mediation of those theories, what it was looking at and what the looking at was going to cost. Vincent Crowe had warned Wyatt Earp to leave because the warning was the instrument his theory specified for this type of situation, and Wyatt Earp had pinned his badge instead because the badge was the instrument his assessment of the situation specified, and the difference between these two instruments was the difference between a theory applied to a situation and a situation understood on its own terms, and that difference was, in Redemption Creek in the spring of 1879, the difference between what Vincent Crowe had built and what remained of it when Wyatt Earp was finished, which was the specific nothing that remained when something built on the wrong assumptions encountered someone whose understanding of what was real did not share those assumptions and was not going to be persuaded to share them by warnings or by anything else, because the badge was already pinned and the coat was already buttoned and the walk was already continuing down the street, and none of those things were going to change based on what Vincent Crowe wanted them to do, which was the fact that all of the subsequent events were a consequence of and the warning that had been intended to prevent them had instead, by failing to produce the departure it was designed to produce, confirmed that they were coming, had in fact been the first of those events rather than the prevention of them, had been the moment when the trajectory of what was going to happen in Redemption Creek became fixed and the only remaining variable was the time it would take to arrive at the conclusion that was already determined. The badge was back in Lund's drawer by the time the summer heat settled over Redemption Creek, and Wyatt Earp was somewhere else, doing the same thing, carrying the same quality of presence into whatever configuration of the same fundamental problem the next town had arrived at, and the badge in the drawer was no longer the badge that had been pinned on the coat on the 8th day, was no longer the same object in any operationally meaningful sense, because the object that mattered had not been the badge but the man who wore it and the walk he took with it under his coat and the specific quality of that walk and what the walk communicated to everyone who saw it about what was going to happen next, and that man was already gone, was already somewhere else, was already walking down someone else's main street with the same level hat and the same unchanged pace, carrying whatever was required for the next situation, which would be the same situation in a different configuration, which was always the same situation in a different configuration, which was the only situation there was, which was the one Wyatt Earp had been designed or had designed himself or had been produced by circumstance and character and accumulated experience to address, and which he addressed, each time, with exactly what it required, no more, no less, beginning with the walk and ending with the leaving and containing, between the two, everything that needed to happen. Arthur Lund kept the drawer locked for 3 months after Wyatt left, and then one morning he unlocked it and took the badge out and held it in his palm for a while, turning it in the light the way a man turns an object he is trying to understand from a new angle, and then he put it in his breast pocket, not pinned, just resting there against the fabric, and went about his day. And he did not pin it and did not announce it and did not make of it any kind of public statement, but the people of Redemption Creek who saw him that day noticed something different in the way he moved through the town, a quality that had not been present before, something in the set of his shoulders and the directness of his path down the main street, and none of them could have named it precisely, but all of them recognized it as the quality of a man who has been reminded of something he knew before the arrangements got to him, the quality of a man who has found his way back to the person he came here intending to be, and the badge in his pocket was not the cause of this quality and was not the source of it, had not put anything into him that was not already there, but had served as the reminder that the already there required, which is the only thing a badge can do for a man who is the right person to wear one, which is to remind him that he is the right person to wear it, and that the wearing of it is not the performance of an institutional role but the expression of something that was his before any institution gave it a name, and that whatever warnings came, whatever the Tuesday mornings brought, whatever Vincent Crowe's arrived with their theories about departure and their confidence about costs, the answer that was available to him was the same answer that had been available to Wyatt Earp on that Tuesday morning, which was to unbutton the coat and let the badge be seen and button the coat again and keep walking. Because the walking was the answer, the continuing was the answer. The unchanged pace and the level hat and the direction maintained were the answer, and no warning that had ever been delivered on any Tuesday morning in any town in the American West had ever been sufficient to make that answer wrong. Clara Hollister told the story for the rest of her life, not often, not in the manner of someone who had been present at a famous event and wanted credit for the proximity, but occasionally, in the specific circumstances that called for it, when someone she was talking to was facing a version of the same problem she had faced on the morning she walked to the marshal's office. The problem of whether the cost of doing the thing that needed to be done was lower or higher than the cost of continuing not to do it, and what she told them was not the full account, not the names and the records and the federal circuit judge, but only the part that mattered for the purpose of the telling, which was the Tuesday morning on the main street and the warning and the badge and the walk that followed, the coat buttoned back over the metal and the pace unchanged and the direction maintained, and she told it not as a story about Wyatt Earp, or not only as that, but as a story about what was possible when a person understood that the warning was not a fact about the world but a theory about them, and that theories about people could be wrong, and that the way to demonstrate that a theory was wrong was not to argue with it but to continue, simply and without announcement, in the direction you were already going, and that the badge, whatever badge you happened to be wearing, was not the source of the authority to continue but the expression of it, and that the expression required the thing it expressed to be real, and that if the thing was real the expression was sufficient, and if the thing was not real no expression would make it so, and that Wyatt Earp had walked down the main street of Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1879 with his coat buttoned over his badge because the thing was real and he knew it was real and the knowing was the only backing the badge had ever needed or received, and that this was what it looked like when someone who knew what they were refused to pretend otherwise for the convenience of someone whose theory required them to be something less.